And this is a new book by Alison Efford, who is a professor at Marquette University and in Milwaukee. She's also the author of German Immigrants, Race, and Citizenship in the Civil War Era. And her co-editor couldn't be here today, but she is Viktorija, who also lives in Milwaukee and is an associate professor of translation and interpreting studies at Marquette. So I'll pass it along to Alison. You can give a brief intro of the book and share anything that inspired you to write it, and we can get started with the beginning of the presentation.
Thank you so much, McKenna. I really appreciate this invitation, and I want to sort of thank Grace Fuhr at Historic Milwaukee as well for the invitation. But I know, McKenna, you're the one who's sort of been doing the behind the scenes work to set everything up. And I'm sometimes on the organizing side of things. So I know that that is real work, and I appreciate it. And I think I should do a shout out to my mother in New Zealand. I think this is the first time she has been able to log on and hear me talk about the book. So hi, Mum. I hope Zoom is working well for you. But really, I'm particularly grateful to have the opportunity to talk to Milwaukee folks. Radical relationships. It really is a Milwaukee book in many ways. As McKenna said, it is a collaboration between me and meine Kollegin, Viktorija Bilic at UWM. And we translated and edited a selection of really remarkably revealing letters to and from Matilda Franziska Anneke, who was a German-born feminist who lived, I was going to say most of her life. She lived longer in Milwaukee than she lived anywhere else. And the book really focuses on Matilda Anneke's relationship with Mary Booth. The two women had what we're calling a romantic friendship, and they met here in Milwaukee in 1859, and they lived together for most of the time from then, 1859 through 1865. So that's sort of overlapping with the US Civil War. Now, I like to say our book really should be a movie. Right? It is the story of whether Matilda and Mary's love will survive. They face these obstacles. Mary's husband rapes a 14-year-old. Matilda's husband is court-martialed and then kicked out of the Union Army in the Civil War. Meanwhile, the two women take 3 of their children and move to Switzerland. Then despite writing and publishing anti-slavery, pro-union work all the time, right? They're working really hard. They're grindingly poor and ill often. Mary has tuberculosis. So I can imagine the movie trailer sort of like, in an unjust patriarchy with poor healthcare, can their love survive? But you don't get the movie today. I am going to try to answer that question, and I'm going to do that by tracing the arc of this relationship. And I want to share my PowerPoint. And I am going to start by introducing the characters. Matilda Franziska Anneke was born in 1817 in Prussian Westphalia, which is now Germany, to an upper middle class family that had fallen on hard times. She was essentially married off at age 19, and it was a terrible marriage. Her first husband was physically abusive and drank too much. And Matilda spent considerable time in her early 20s trying to extract herself and her baby from this relationship. And that experience of trying to get a divorce and custody inspired her lifelong feminism. So she wrote a treatise Das Weib im Konflikt mit dem sozialen Verhältnissen, which is translated as woman in conflict with society, which argued that the laws and the conventions surrounding marriage enslaved women. During the revolutions of 1848, Matilda published a dissident newspaper in Cologne and became quite famous for fighting in the Baden campaign for a German republic. That's the image you see. It's from Madame Anneke fighting in Baden with the Republican forces. It was just months after she had given birth to her second child with her second husband, Fritz Anneke. She didn't carry a gun, but she donned trousers and she mounted a horse and she rode as an Ordnanzoffizierin, a sort of military aide, transporting messages on the battlefield. The revolutions of 1848 failed, and like many of other 48ers, right, these politically involved people from the revolutions of 1848, Matilda and Fritz end up in the United States. They flee as exiles to the United States, and they end up here, specifically in Milwaukee. They have a difficult decade. Matilda in particular, the 1850s do not treat Matilda well. She lost 4 children to disease. She saw her feminist newspaper fold, and she sort of grows apart from Fritz, her new husband. And don't worry, she would later go on to open a girls' school, to serve as a founding vice president of the National Women's Suffrage Association, and she helped form an all-female section of the International Workers Association. But that was in the future. At the end of the 1850s, Matilda had hit a real low. Enter Mary Booth. Mary Booth is seated here, and you see Matilda, I guess on the left side of the photo from my perspective, standing behind Mary. Mary was born in New Haven, Connecticut, and she was about 14 years younger than Matilda. She would go on in the 1860s to publish poetry and translations and other writing. But in the late 1850s, her chief claim to fame is really her relationship with her husband, Sherman Booth. I'm not sure how many of you are familiar with Sherman Booth. When I talk to people outside of Milwaukee, I say he's still known around Milwaukee, although I realize that might be sort of quite select Milwaukee circles where the name Sherman Booth is still known. But there's a Booth Street, Milwaukeeans, you may be familiar with Booth Street. Sherman was the leading abolitionist in Wisconsin. And he was in and out of jail because he had helped a man named Joshua Glover escape from slavery. Maybe some of you are slightly more familiar with the name Joshua Glover. So Joshua Glover had been enslaved in Missouri and had escaped. And then in the 1850s, after the passage of the Fugitive Slave Act, US authorities had recaptured Joshua Glover with the goal of sending him back to slavery. And Sherman Booth was the leader of the effort to sort of rile up opposition in Milwaukee and break Glover out of jail so that he could head on to Canada. So Mary Booth is married to Sherman Booth. the movie, the book's through line, and I'm imagining this future movie, the movie's through line really has to be this relationship between Matilda and Mary. It wasn't typical for two women to raise children together and to leave such a detailed and extensive record of their feelings. But it was not uncommon for women to develop intense romantic friendships in the 19th century. The Victorian period is famous for the veneration of the heterosexual nuclear family, but effusive and even physically close relationships between women and also between men were socially accepted in both Europe and the United States. These, and probably New Zealand for that matter, these neo-Europes. These relationships could be very intense, they could be erotic and consuming, but romantic friends did not identify as lesbian because the category really had yet to crystallize. I think that's a sort of an important point as we go forward, that categories of sexual orientation didn't really firm up until the late 19th century, the late 1800s. And the scholarship in this area is particularly strong on gay men, showing, right, there had always been men who had sex with men, but it's not until the late 1800s that you had research sort of pathologizing same-sex attraction, as well as the sort of large-scale emergence of a gay identification and gay community. So although there is kind of some good scholarship out there on romantic friendship, I've found it's really easy for it to become flattened, so that romantic friends either become sort of just friends, but in this really weird 19th century overwrought sort of way, or they become sort of lesbians who didn't know that they were lesbians. I would like to kind of really confront this sort of oxymoron, what seems like an oxymoron to our ears, of romantic friendship. I want to confront that sort of head on and grapple with it, that tension between the two areas, the idea of romance and friendship. Romantic friendship really defies our categories of straight or lesbian, and erotic or platonic for that matter. Matilda and Mary met in Milwaukee in early 1859, or perhaps very late 1858. And within a few months, Matilda had moved into the Booth household to care for Mary. Mary was sick. She had a whole range of symptoms, but the most ominous was that she coughed up blood. And Matilda stayed up nights looking after her. Matilda, for her part, was still reeling from losing 4 children, as you would. And Mary, who had lost a baby herself, really threw herself into comforting Matilda. And at one point they go together to Forest Home Cemetery, where Mary's dead baby is buried, and they both sort of come together around remembering their dead children at that grave. And they really became inseparable. In Matilda and Mary's case, this sort of mutual comfort came along with the probing of the boundaries of women's proper roles. When Mary first met Matilda, she wrote admiringly about her to her sister, explaining that Matilda had been in battle like Joan of Arc. And then in a later letter to her mother, Mary said, "Matilda wishes I could have been with her in battle," 2 exclamation points, which suggests that the two had discussed this and spent time thinking about how Matilda's involvement in this masculine realm, how that related to their relationship to each other. At the same time, I think Mary thinks that her mother might disapprove of Matilda's unconventional activities. Mary insisted to her mother that Matilda had joined the battle because of her love of country, right? German nationalism. It was important in the revolutions of 1848, and also her love of her husband. Mary quite misleadingly wrote to her mother that Matilda, quote, hates American women's rights females. That really threw me the first time I read it. And I think that there certainly were tensions between Matilda's secular style and the really very Protestant spirit of the Anglo-American women's rights movement. But Matilda, by this time, had already attended women's rights conventions on the East Coast. And later on, she would work more closely with Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony. So I think that Mary's anticipating her mother's possible objection to Matilda and the relationship. In the same letter, Mary couldn't help but really sort of gush about Matilda's beauty and achievements and the respect with which so many people regarded her. In April of 1859, so pretty soon, we're moving pretty far. They've just met, and then already in April, Matilda's husband Fritz left to head back to Europe to work as a reporter, while Matilda stayed with Mary in Milwaukee. And it becomes clear that Mary was somewhat replacing Fritz in Matilda's life. Matilda wrote, "Dear Fritz, we should never have married. We should have stayed friends, and we may have both led happier lives. And indeed, we love each other more like friends now. We love each other since we are most intimately related through the children we have together. But we do not love each other like lovers who both feel that their desire for each other fills their existence and can only be satisfied by the touch of pure lips when they kiss." I think here you see Matilda had very high expectations of her relationships. She suggests here that Fritz was at fault for not being passionate enough. She's sort of blaming him while also rejecting him, and then working in the steamy imagery to boot. Matilda was also replacing Sherman for Mary. So that marriage, Mary and Sherman's marriage, came under great strain because Sherman was tried for seduction. I am going to be talking about this case for the Max Carter Institute at UW-Madison in February. So I can share details of that talk if you're interested in a really deep dive on that trial. But let me share the basics here. Sherman was 46 in February of 1859, and Caroline Cook was 14. Mary was away at a wedding, so Caroline had come over to look after the Booth girls. And then when it got late, Caroline went to sleep in Mary's room. Mary and Sherman had separate rooms, and Caroline went to sleep in Mary's room. But Sherman came in naked and got into bed with her, woke her up. And based on the trial transcript, I would characterize what followed as rape, but the charge was seduction. in Wisconsin, a man could get 1 to 5 years in prison if he was found to have, quote, seduced and had illicit connection with an unmarried female of previously chaste character. So yes, it explicitly hinges on assessments of the girl or woman's character. And yeah, you can imagine the trial was just as bad as it sounds. Both Matilda and Mary opposed Sherman Booth's lawyers' efforts to, quote, hunt up evidence for him against the girl. Matilda also worked to shield Mary from the fallout surrounding the trial. She notably sort of intervenes and dresses down Sherman Booth's lawyers because they want Mary. They're trying to persuade Mary to come out publicly in support of Sherman, and she won't. Sherman was not found guilty because there was a hung jury, and he wasn't re-prosecuted after there was a hung jury. But the letters in our book show that the people who knew him best believed that he was guilty. All right, leaving Sherman behind. Mary decided to leave Sherman behind the following year, right? So 1860, the late summer of 1860, Matilda and Mary set off with one of the Booth daughters and the 2 Anneke children who survived and lived at home, and they set off for Zürich, Switzerland. On the way, Matilda stayed at Newark, and Mary visited family in Connecticut. So they're all sort of in and around the New York City area as they're heading out. And we have a very interesting letter from Matilda to Mary at that point as they're leaving the country. Most of the letter is in Matilda's English, which is charming, I think, but quite difficult to understand. Her English was not the best. And it's mostly about arrangements. It's about passports and money and where they're going to rendezvous in New York City to get on the boat. But then Matilda wrote, burn this letter when you have, quote, half understood it. And a few sentences later, she switched into German. I dedicate my life to you. Even if you have lost everything, you still have me. And my true love for you is eternal. And she ends the letter saying, please know that no other heart beats for you like the heart of your Francisca Maria. They're about to leave Sherman behind, and Matilda is committing herself to Mary. The burning reference, I would say, it's not entirely clear. It's possible, it seems possible to me that Matilda's a bit embarrassed about her English skills. But it's also possible that she wants to conceal information about the relationship that she has with Mary, especially perhaps from Mary's mother, with whom I suspect Mary was staying when she received this letter. I'd say likewise, the decision to use German, the meaning of that is sort of ambiguous too. German could have been the language in which Matilda felt that she could express these authentic, deep feelings of love. Or again, maybe she's using German to sort of conceal these feelings from English speakers who might read the letter. Either way, I think there is a sense of an alluring, sort of secretive mode of communication where there's this mixture of German and English. And I would add that they usually called each other Maria for Mary and Francisca Maria for Matilda. Mary said that she thought that the name Matilda was ugly and she wouldn't use it. So she used Francisca and then Francisca Maria. So these are sort of pet names. No one else uses them. The most explicit letters, or most direct letters, don't worry, we're G-rated. The most direct letters that survive come from Mary in Zurich, while the 2 women and 3 children are living there. They lived for a time with Fritz as well, but pretty quickly he returned to the United States to fight in the Civil War, and the household is at that point composed of the 2 women and 3 children, and they have a maid too. So for Christmas, as a Christmas gift, in 1862, Matilda wrote a quite sentimental poem that ends with her offering herself as a gift. I have but one little thing, scarcely worth the offering, yet this little thing I hold never could be bought for gold, not for all the pearls and gems in the world's bright diadems. Though it be of little worth, it is all I have on earth. It may not be found or bought, yet I give it all unsought. Take and lay it on the shelf, for it only is myself. Know what a physical image that is? Mary was objectifying herself. She was not talking about herself as a soul or a spirit or a scent. Those come up elsewhere. But here she's talking about herself as something that could physically lie on a shelf. I like this one, this little note better, I have to say. Again, it's Mary to Matilda when they're both in Switzerland. Pardon me, my dear, for writing you such a miserable little note saying I was unhappy. I am indeed very happy when I think of your sweet love. It glorifies every even and illuminates the darkest midnights. You are the morning star of my soul, the beautiful auroral glow of my heart, the saintly lily of my dream, the deep, dark rosebud unfolding in my bosom day by day, sweetening my life with your ethereal fragrance. Dearest, you are the reality of my dreams, my life, my love. I have no more sorrow. I have you, my dear and dearest friend. Good night. It's interesting here because the ending, friend, it almost feels, I think, to modern ears as though she's cutting the legs out from the whole thing. It's sort of like, oh, just friends. In this context, however, I think it makes sense to see this as evidence that Mary saw this friendship as a huge deal. She didn't say my lover, but she associated friendship with all sorts of really intense imagery. I would say, in addition to this sort of sentimentality, there were plenty of kisses and holding hands and bed sharing. There was also jealousy. Mary teased Matilda by talking about how she flirted with Ferdinand Lassalle, who's an important German socialist. And then another woman, Cecilia Kapp, wrote to Matilda distraught because Matilda had apparently told Cecilia that they couldn't have a closer relationship because she could not be, quote, unfaithful to Mary. All right, at this point in the movie, we turn our attention back to North America. The women were actually very closely following the Civil War from Switzerland. They published abolitionist fiction and they wrote opinion pieces on the war for German American and German European audiences. Interestingly, I think Matilda had always really believed in violence as a way to effect change. She was very pro John Brown. So she was interested in how the war was waged. And she thought about like, what would an abolitionist war look like? In March of 1862, she wrote to Fritz and said, the divine institution, she means slavery, the divine institution will probably continue to exist until the last war, which the Negroes will fight themselves. It's sort of almost an apocalyptic vision of slavery only ending when Black people took up arms, because that's the beginning, remember, the beginning of the Civil War before the Emancipation Proclamation, when Lincoln is moving more slowly than Matilda would like towards the idea of ending slavery. Matilda was also drawn into Fritz's quite personal dramas as he sought to contribute meaningfully, I would say, to the Union cause, and also, you know, achieve the recognition that he believed he deserved. He had been an artillery officer in the Prussian army, and he had a very high opinion of his own military skills. He could only think of one reason why other German American officers were doing well in the Union Army, and he was not. Conspiracy. He thought there was a conspiracy against him. In spring of 1863, he was stationed at Fort Halleck near Columbus, Kentucky. And you can see a little map there. I don't know, it's a bit hard to see, but this is far western Kentucky. It's on the edge of the Mississippi River. And Fritz believed that members of the Freemasons, right, so the secretive fraternity, sort of, which is subject to a lot of conspiracy theory, the subject of a lot of conspiracy theories. He believed that the Freemasons at this post were in cahoots against him. He was a colonel leading the 34th Wisconsin Infantry, and there was another Wisconsin colonel, a man named Isaac Messmore. So another colonel, same rank as Fritz, who actually commanded the post, and so was superior to Fritz in that regard. And Fritz and Isaac Messmore get into an altercation, and in the end, well, there's a lot. Read the book. There are sort of machinations. But Fritz insulted and then defied Isaac Messmore. And he was there, after that, he was arrested and put on house arrest outside the post. There were lots of twists and turns with Fritz leaving when he was not supposed to and going to Cairo, Illinois. But eventually a court-martial passed down the decision of military degradation, and Fritz was kicked out of the Union Army. Matilda felt that Fritz had been wronged, but she was also frustrated and embarrassed because she's sort of still connected with this man. People know her as Fritz Anneke's wife. So she wrote to Fritz in a private letter, "Your strengths and defiance should be directed towards things other than such miserable and humiliating quarrels. Disgrace triumphs and you come out on the short end. You always get caught up in such affairs due to your irritability." But I think the movie has to end, kind of going back to the relationship between Matilda and Mary. Mary's health was rapidly declining, and she believed correctly that she had American friends who could afford to help her pay for experimental medical treatment. Also, her older daughter had stayed with her mother in Connecticut. And if Mary felt like she was going to die, and if she was going to die, she wanted to see her older daughter again. So in 1864, she returned to the United States. Matilda was devastated by the separation. She wrote about that to Fritz. But her response to the devastation was really to disengage emotionally. And I have students, I think, who will never forgive her for this. But she didn't reply much to Mary's sort of incredibly frequent letters from New York, her sort of pleading, heartbreaking letters as she is getting sicker and sicker. And Mary died within a year, in April 1865, the same month, right, that the fighting in the Civil War ends. My beloved Mary is no more, Matilda wrote to Fritz. Mary was the great love of Matilda's life. The relationship was one of caring devotion and also passionate charge. Instead of thinking how we can fit romantic friendship into our categories of lesbian or straight, it's more useful to think about how we can use romantic friendship to interrogate those categories. I do not mean to deny lesbians a history. I hope they do claim Matilda and Mary, but I would argue that this was a queer relationship that predated the categories of both lesbian and straight. We don't need to assume that Matilda and Mary's relationship was a typical romantic friendship, or the only type of romantic friendship you could have, to see that it can illustrate the radical potential of romantic friendship. This relationship sustained the women when men failed them. It allowed Mary to stand with Caroline Cook against Sherman and his lawyers in the seduction trial. It helped Matilda bounce back from the ignominy of having a husband discharged from the army. For a time, it allowed them to raise their children and pursue their writing careers together. The letters in our book tell a dramatic story, and they highlight the power of women's relationships. I will stop sharing there. I think McKenna has put a code, the discount code, if you want a copy of the book for 30% off and free US shipping. You can use a code at the website, the press, the University of Georgia Press website for the book. Yeah, and that's now in the chat. So go for it.
Yeah, thanks so much. I just put it in there so people can easily click the link, and then I'll send this in an email to follow up too, just to make sure everyone who is here got a chance to see it. Thank you so much. That was a really, really interesting, an interesting history lesson, kind of hearing these like firsthand from the people who lived it. And it seems like such a treasure to have these letters. And I was curious too, how did you first start on this project, and like where do you find an archive of these kind of things?
There are two great collections at the Wisconsin Historical Society. So they're housed, actually I think the Booth letters might actually be at UW Milwaukee, but the Anneke family letters are in Madison at the Wisconsin Historical Society. And I was aware of Matilda Anneke and her letters. I'm not sort of completely discovering her. People know about Matilda Anneke, but the letters are in this Kurzschrift, this strange 19th century German handwriting. So even people who read German sort of struggle to kind of read through this strange handwriting. And yeah, when I met Viktorija, when she first came to UWM, we sort of think, oh, we have to do a project together, and this just seemed like the perfect project. But if anyone is who doesn't speak, well, first of all, there are translations in the book, but the Booth letters are also really interesting, and they've been digitized. If anyone sort of has an interest in this, you can. With the right Google search, you'll be able to find the link and poke around in Mary's letters. I really wish we could have included more of Mary's letters, especially the year where she's sort of in New York dying. They're very revealing and intense, and it's very interesting, sort of the types of medical care that she thinks may possibly save her life.
Wow. Yeah, I bet going back in time like that and knowing what we know about medicine now, it must have been interesting. I mean, it sounds like she was willing to take any chance she could because you just wanted to stay alive.
Yeah. So yeah, tuberculosis is bacterial, and now it's, I mean, there's some resistant forms, but it's relatively, with antibiotics, it's relatively easy to treat, but back then it could be a death sentence. And so she was right. I mean, that she was right to sort of, that it wow, some of the things could hurt. There were some very strange things that they tried, but yeah.
Okay, see one question here. Can you go into a little more detail about how and why her feminist newspaper failed?
That's actually, okay. So the standard story that you might see is that male printers in Milwaukee struck that they refused to work alongside a woman, and they would not print her newspaper. That's true that happened, and I think you would be limited if you were writing in German. You always use a special sort of typeface, the Fraktur typeface. That it was sort of unimaginable to use the Latin style typeface. So I think that did contribute, but I think that people sort of like throw it out there as this kind of unicausal thing, where actually she ended up. They followed Fritz's work, and they went and lived in Zürich for a little while in the mid-1850s, and she continued to try and publish a newspaper there, and she did for a little bit, and then all the children start dying because they all die over on the East Coast, and she had limited support. So I think it's sort of complicated how it folded.
Yeah, that makes sense. There is another question in the chat from David. It says, hi, Alison. Matilda was not the only woman who accompanied her husband in the 1848 revolutions and the American Civil War. Emma Herway, Amelie Sturve, and Madame Turchin, wife of Mad Russian John Basil Turchin. And a question, how typical was it for these women to participate in these masculine activities? And what does it say about these radicals and their views on women's roles in society?
It would be, I would love to have this, the conversation, and I've listened to Dave talk about some of the other women and their involvement in 1848 too. I still don't think, there are these great examples. I still don't think it's typical, but there was a really, as I'm sure Dave knows, there was this really interesting, strong strand of sort of marriage reform, I would say, was how what it was focused. There's even a book by a scholar named Dagmar Herzog who argues that really the revolutions of 1848, forget all the forget the politics and the sort of Marxian economics. It was really about marriage and the church. And I wouldn't go as far as Dagmar Herzog goes, but it is this really interesting sort of frustration with traditional Catholicism, especially for Matilda and the area of German Europe that she was in, that sort of rethinking gender roles was part of it for them. And Emma Herweg was, I don't know if Dave's had a chance to look at the book yet, but she turns up and she was known for having an extramarital affair, but she ends up in Zürich. So the Matilda and Mary hang out with the Herwegs, and Mary translates Georg, that's Emma's husband, his poetry, and the children play together. So there are ways in which they're part of this kind of expat community in Zürich, right? Germans who don't want to live in the German states. Switzerland is sort of different, but there's Swiss German spoken there, and are making this sort of, have created this little community. I've had people say to me, well, why Switzerland? Switzerland seems very backward on gender rights. It's very late in women's suffrage and things like that. But there was this sort of little community that was radical.
Great, thanks for sharing that. And see another, looks like we have a Q&A, and then one more question in the chat. In the Q&A first, can you talk a little bit more about your own career, or just briefly like how this relationship came to your attention?
Yeah. I always think it's harder to kind of create a narrative of one's own life. When I moved to the United States, I was sort of interested in getting my head around the United States and what it was, what it meant. And I think that's part of what attracted me to history. And I'd learned German in high school in New Zealand, and then done a student exchange. And I very quickly realized it's easy to say new things about US history if you read the German language sources. It's sort of, it's kind of, there's so much out there in the German language that there's a lot of low-hanging fruit. And so I was particularly interested in race and citizenship and the Civil War and its aftermath. And that's sort of how I got to Matilda Anneke. And I know, to be honest, the extent of information about her relationship with Mary Booth sort of surprised me. Again, so people sort of knew Matilda's daughter, Herta, lived to a very old age, and she donated the papers to the Wisconsin Historical Society. And she went out of her way to say my mother was not a lesbian, which I think, so this was around World War II. She would have been younger than 10. So the daughter would have been younger than 10 when Mary Booth died. So it's hard to sort of think that she was speaking from firsthand kind of knowledge of the relationship. And so I read it a little bit more as just because she was a feminist doesn't mean that she was a lesbian. Mm-hmm. And there's sort of, and then so people have kind of looked at this relationship without going too deep. And I think that having all the different letters that we're sort of putting together, in many ways it sort of surprised me. And this was meant to just be a little side project that I was going to do really quickly as I got on and got back to my other work.
Yeah, and turn into something bigger, and now it's a book people can go buy, and maybe a movie someday.
I hope so. I just think it has to be a movie.
I'm going to go, I think this will be our last question. And this is from Lolly. I have been fond of Matilda Anneke for a long time before I included her in my memorable Milwaukee book. I tried to find access to her newspaper. Supposedly there is one copy still in existence. Have you seen it or included it in your book? And have you written about her? This is a German word I can't pronounce. Tochterschule.
Yeah.
And then thank you for your presentation.
Thank you for the question. I have seen a copy of the one surviving issue of the newspaper. It is not in the book, and I'm trying to, maybe if you email me my Marquette email address, I will try to track it down for you. It's really frustrating that more issues don't survive. But the one, and I'm trying to think of the exact context in which I saw it, the one that I had, she does come out very clearly. This is 1852 in Milwaukee for women's suffrage, which she hadn't done when she was in Germany, just talking about the injustice of marriage. She came out in favor of women's suffrage, and this is understood to be the first woman-run feminist newspaper in the United States, and it's in German from Milwaukee. But we really do focus on 1859 to 1865. We started off the project thinking, oh, we'll just include everything. And then you're like, oh, whoa. I mean, even for the period we covered, I think it was about 30% of the surviving letters for that period. We had to be very selective to make a book that someone would actually publish. And then the Töchterschule, which is a daughter's school. So Töchter is with the umlauts, the plural for Tochter, Töchter, daughters. It was a private academy that Matilda ran after the book ends. And I'm sort of aware of some of the scholarship on it. I have not written about it myself. It was quite a small school. And I know what the little pieces I have worked on, it's sort of interesting to me that families that I would consider quite conservative, like the Pfisters, I'm trying to think of other big names, like these big name German-American Milwaukee families, they sent their daughters to this school, and they sort of defended Matilda Anneke. They didn't share her radicalism, but they said, she's a really good educator and she doesn't try to bring all of her radicalism into the classroom. So I thought that was interesting how she was quite different from Fritz, sort of like no one liked Fritz. He was just really difficult, but everyone seemed to like Matilda, even if they didn't agree with her politics.
That's so interesting. Oh, we got one more comment. Not a question, but FYI, I'm a descendant of an early Wisconsin German newspaper family. My great-grandmother took over the editorship of the Columbia County Wecker when my great-grandfather passed with the Civil War-related injuries. Oh, that was from who previously commented. So interesting.
That's fascinating. And that would, I mean, especially in a more rural context. Ooh, I'm going to have to look into that. Thank you for sharing that comment.
Yeah, and thank you everyone for being here. And I'll send a follow-up email. And if you want to get in contact with Alison, feel free to ask me. And I can provide your Marquette email if that works for you, if anyone has further questions. Right, perfect. And thank you so much for presenting for us. That was really interesting, and that was like a great perspective from these histories, especially with how they connect to Milwaukee too.
Thank you so much.
All right, have a good night, everyone.